I was wrapping up a stack of case summaries in my office when my phone began vibrating in a way that felt louder than the buzzing fluorescent lights above me. An unknown number flashing across the screen like a warning sign I hadn't yet learned to recognize. So I stepped outside into the cold concrete hallway where the air smelled faintly of cleaning solution and answered with my name, expecting a telemarketer or some wrong number, only to hear a voice from my past that hadn't spoken my name in over a decade. A former classmate who now ran a discreet medical testing lab on the far side of the city. Someone who once owed me more than he ever admitted because I had stood by him when no one else did. And when he told me, the results were final and absolute, and that the biological comparison showed no relation whatsoever, not even a trace. I felt the weight of weeks of silent dread collapse into something strangely quiet inside me, not explosive or dramatic but eerily calm. And I thanked him before ending the call and standing alone beside my car, staring at nothing for a long time as the truth settled into a place where hope used to live, realizing that every doubt I had buried was not paranoia, but instinct finally proven right. And the silence that followed was not empty, but heavy with everything I could no longer deny. Because for a fleeting moment I had still wanted to believe there was another explanation, some absurd coincidence that would let me pretend my life was still intact. Yet the evidence had closed every door I was afraid to open, leaving me with no more questions, only clarity that felt sharp and cold like winter air in my lungs. Weeks before that call, long before certainty replaced suspicion, I had been doing something ordinary and mindless like cleaning the clutter out of her vehicle, moving coffee cups and gym towels and loose receipts from one side to the other, when I noticed something lodged deep inside the plastic liner of the cup holder, something white and unmistakable that didn't belong among crumbs and old napkins. And when I pulled it free, my hands began shaking as two bold lines stared back at me like a sentence already written. And my mind began spiraling because we had barely touched each other in months, drifting like strangers who shared a roof but not a life. And yet she had said nothing, not a single word about something that should have changed everything, which was when the smallest inconsistencies began linking together like pieces of a puzzle I had tried not to see. Her late nights, her distant eyes, her constant exhaustion paired with an energy she reserved for places I was never invited to know about. And I felt like I had stumbled into the first chapter of a story that I never agreed to read, but one that was already unfolding without my consent. The more I observed, the clearer the fractures became, like hairline cracks spreading across glass, until suddenly the whole surface looked different. And I remembered the day I casually tried to check the time on her phone, while mine was charging in the kitchen, only to be blocked by a new password she never mentioned changing, her reaction strangely defensive, followed by a series of Wednesday evenings she claimed were dedicated to a small reading group that didn't exist when I asked one of her longtime friends about it at a summer gathering. And though I said nothing, choosing instead to pretend ignorance, my mind began tracking everything the way a detective follows shadows, because confronting her would have only driven the lies deeper. So I waited, watched, and stored every detail, every contradiction, every quiet moment when her phone lit up and her attention drifted far from me, until one evening when she left it on the table unlocked, and I memorized the pattern she used without letting a flicker of emotion cross my face, knowing that patience would reveal what confrontation never could. When the following Wednesday arrived and she walked out the door with the same rehearsed excuse, I waited until the house was silent before retrieving her tablet from the bedroom and entering the passcode I had committed to memory, navigating through digital layers of her life until I reached the image folder where everything looked harmless at first, endless photos of meals and mirrors and mundane moments, until curiosity pulled me into the hidden space where deleted files lingered before disappearing forever. And there it was, another photograph of a test identical to the one I had found, dated days after, confirming not only that she knew, but that she had actively chosen to erase evidence while assuming I would remain blind. and I sat there for what felt like hours staring at that glowing screen, realizing that betrayal does not always scream. Sometimes it whispers until the silence becomes unbearable, and from that moment on, I stopped wondering if something was wrong and started preparing for what I would do when the truth fully emerged. The next morning, I contacted my old acquaintance and explained everything without embellishment, leaving out emotion and focusing only on facts, and he agreed to run a private analysis if I could obtain a sample, something that required no confrontation, no theft, only patience. And when she left a half-finished bottle in the car after a workout, I sealed it carefully and delivered it without hesitation, marking the beginning of 3 weeks of waiting that felt like walking through fog. Watching her move through our home like everything was normal while knowing every word she spoke was built on a foundation of lies, and I realized that waiting for answers was easier than living with uncertainty, because the worst outcome no longer frightened me the way not knowing once had. And by the time the call finally came, I had already planned my escape, gathering financial records, opening new accounts, and arranging legal counsel in silence, building a future without her, before she even realized the present was crumbling. When I returned home that evening, I wore calm like armor, not out of cruelty but because anger would have given her power, and she noticed immediately that something had changed, asking why I seemed lighter, why my eyes no longer held the tired weight of pretending, and I deflected with vague answers that made her uneasy, watching as suspicion flickered behind her gaze, while she tried to maintain control of a narrative already slipping through her fingers. And every question she asked only confirmed that she sensed the truth approaching even if she didn't know its shape yet. And I felt no guilt for the silence because honesty had been absent from this house long before I chose it. And when she retreated upstairs gripping her phone as if it were a lifeline, I sat at the table reading the email that confirmed everything was ready, knowing that the calm I felt was not happiness, but the quiet resolve of someone finally stepping out of a storm. The following morning unfolded like a slow-burning fuse, ordinary words laced with hidden meaning, her unease growing as she searched my face for answers I refused to give. And when I gently turned her questions back on her, asking if there was anything she wished to share, her composure faltered, replaced by defensive accusations and hurried movements that revealed more than her words ever could. And when she claimed to be working on a weekend project she had never mentioned, I saw the desperation beneath the lie, a fragile structure built to protect a secret already collapsing. And as she walked out, phone pressed to her ear, I felt no triumph, only a deep understanding that the truth, once revealed, cannot be contained, and I waited for the moment when it would finally surface. That moment arrived in the quiet of evening when tension filled every corner of the room like static before a storm, and when I asked the question she feared most, the one that stripped away all pretense, her reaction said everything before her voice ever could. And when I revealed that I had seen the proof, not just one but two tests, her silence confirmed the betrayal more loudly than any confession. And as I explained the analysis and placed the legal documents before her, I watched the life she thought she controlled unravel in her hands, realizing that deception, once exposed, leaves no room for negotiation, and that sometimes the most powerful response is simply refusing to continue participating in a lie. She pleaded, she blamed loneliness. She called it a mistake, but words cannot undo months of choices. And when I told her everything was already in motion, that separation was inevitable, she finally understood that consequences do not wait for permission. And though tears streamed down her face, I felt no satisfaction, only closure, because betrayal ends relationships long before paperwork ever does. And when I walked out that door, I carried no anger with me, only the certainty that freedom begins the moment you stop accepting what destroys you. I spent the night in a quiet hotel across town, not because I was afraid of facing her, but because I needed distance from the emotional wreckage that now existed in a place that used to feel like home. And when I returned the next afternoon, the house looked like a storm had passed through it, even though nothing had been physically destroyed. tissues scattered across the living room, curtains half drawn, and her sitting on the couch with hollow eyes that told me she had finally realized that denial no longer protected her. And she asked to talk as if the words themselves might rewind time. But I reminded her that everything that needed to be said already had been, though I allowed her a few minutes to speak, because closure is not about forgiveness but about finality. And as she begged for another chance, offering counseling and promises that sounded rehearsed, I calmly explained that love cannot survive where trust has been burned to the ground, and that staying would only teach me to tolerate betrayal, something I refused to do even if it meant rebuilding my life from nothing. She tried to grasp onto memories, recounting the early years when we laughed easily and dreamed without limits, but nostalgia cannot revive something poisoned by deception. And when I showed her the financial separation that had already taken place, the reality finally hit her that this was not a threat or a dramatic reaction but a decision carved in stone. And though she insisted that people deserved second chances, I told her that forgiveness does not require reconciliation, and that sometimes the bravest choice is to walk away from what hurts you even when your heart is still learning to let go. And when she reached for me, I stepped back, realizing that compassion without boundaries becomes self-destruction, and I left again, not with rage but with quiet determination to protect the life I was now reclaiming. By the time the week ended, the truth had spread through circles we once shared, not because I sought revenge but because lies collapse under their own weight. And as family members and friends reached out, I told them only the facts, without embellishment, because honesty requires no dramatic framing. And though some attempted to excuse her behavior or minimize its impact, I reminded them that betrayal is not defined by one moment but by the thousands of lies that surround it. And when her own relatives finally understood the reality, silence replaced denial. And in that quiet I felt a strange peace, knowing I no longer had to carry a secret that was never mine to hold. Days turned into weeks, and life slowly rearranged itself around a new routine, one without constant suspicion or emotional tension. And though there were moments when grief surfaced unexpectedly, I learned to let it pass rather than drown in it, focusing instead on rebuilding what had been neglected while I was trying to save something that no longer existed. And when I returned to old friendships and hobbies, I rediscovered parts of myself that had been buried under compromise, realizing that losing a relationship does not mean losing your future, only the version of it that was never meant to last. The legal process moved quickly once evidence was presented, and while negotiations briefly turned hostile, the facts spoke louder than arguments, and the outcome reflected the truth of what had happened, not as punishment but as consequence. And when the final documents were signed, I felt lighter than I had in years, not because the pain had vanished but because it no longer controlled me, and that freedom became the foundation on which I began constructing a life that belonged to me alone. I moved into a smaller place across town, modest and quiet, but every empty wall felt like possibility rather than loss. And as I unpacked each box, I realized how much of my past I no longer needed to carry forward, and though memories still existed, they no longer defined who I was becoming. And in that space, I began cultivating routines that nourished rather than drained me, learning that self-respect grows strongest when it is no longer compromised for the sake of familiarity. Months later, when our paths crossed unexpectedly, I felt no bitterness, only distance, and though she spoke of regret and hardship, I understood that sympathy does not require reopening closed doors, and when I wished her well and walked away, I realized that closure is not found in conversations but in acceptance, and that sometimes indifference is the truest sign of healing. Opportunities followed that I might never have noticed before: professional growth, new friendships, experiences untainted by past pain. And with each step forward, I felt more aligned with the person I had once been before compromise eroded my sense of worth. And I learned that transformation often arrives disguised as loss, forcing us to choose whether we remain stuck or evolve into something stronger. One evening, surrounded by people who knew nothing of my past, laughing without hesitation. I felt the quiet joy of starting again, not because everything was perfect, but because it was honest, and that honesty gave me peace that no relationship built on deception ever could. And in that moment, I understood that endings are not failures, but transitions that carry us toward lives that fit who we have become. The road ahead no longer felt uncertain, only open, and as I drove home beneath city lights that once symbolized isolation, they now felt like beacons guiding me forward, and I realized that freedom is not the absence of pain but the presence of choice. The power to walk away from what no longer serves you and toward a future defined by self-respect, resilience, and quiet strength. And in that understanding, I finally found the calm I had been searching for, not in revenge or validation, but in knowing that I had chosen myself, that I had stepped out of the shadow of betrayal and into a life that was no longer shaped by someone else's lies. And as I closed the door behind me and stood in the stillness of my own space, I smiled not because I had won, but because I was finally free.